All right, guys, welcome back for today's lecture of, let's see, it'll be April 8th, Wednesday. Yesterday we talked about the Pacific, talked about Iwo Jima and American plans for Japan. Real quick, we're going to flash back, or not in time, but travel to Europe to go over the events taking place there. Now, we skipped a lot of the individual battles in Europe, and I kind of just wanted to highlight the big ones. You know, we're kind of cut down on time here, so I'm speeding through it. But there's no way we could talk about World War II and not talk about D-Day. D-Day is a fascinating story that I love. I think it's amazing. Now, if you're wondering what D-Day means, what the D in D-Day means, I'm afraid you're probably going to be disappointed. It doesn't mean Doomsday or Demolition Day or any of that. The D in D-Day means day. The term for this literally is day. In American military code, they use they talk about an event about the time or place that an operation is going to take place. So when they talk about the event of an operation happening, they use the letter H to signify, well, this is the hour it's going to happen. They use the letter D to decide, well, this is the day it's going to happen. There are thousands of D-days in American history. The day really any operation that we planned goes into effect is known as D-Day. It's just that this individual day is probably the most impactful and most exciting and most consequential of the D-Days. So um, it gets full release on using this day. Now, the story behind D-Day is a long one, and if we were in the classroom, I had a bunch of videos that I'd show talking about the secrecy that went into planning D-Day, the fakes, the codes. Like the British um, wanted the Germans to think that an invasion was coming from another part of Britain and was going to land in another part of Europe. So, and they knew that German planes were flying overhead taking pictures of everything. So they put like inflatable tanks on the ground. And when a German recon plane flew over, take pictures of it. And then they deflate the tank and they move it 60 miles down the road in an hour. And that same plane would fly overhead and take a picture of the reinflated tank. And they think, holy crap, we just saw that tank 60 miles away an hour ago, meaning that tank could travel 60 miles an hour. Then they go back to Germany and say, my goodness, the British have these weapons that are so much better than ours. Then there's a whole thing with like a London crossword puzzle in the newspaper. It's a long story, but it's a good one if you have time to try and look it up. Um, but this was such a secretive operation. Like no public knew about it. No American citizens, no British citizens. Like all of the commanders that were involved in the planning, they were basically forced into a quarantine for the 8 months that this planning took place because they didn't want anybody telling anybody anything. That's how secretive this was. And this was an all or nothing mission. If D-Day fails, the Nazis will win World War II. They will at least defeat the British and the Americans. And then they could focus on defeating the Soviets. But this was a massively important event. So the basics on D-Day, troops leave Britain on not really ships. They're not typical boats. They're kind of rovers. They just kind of float in the ground, and inside are a bunch of soldiers that are sitting there. And there's the materials to when they get on the ground to build a tank or build artillery weapons. Like there's a whole bunch involved. D-Day was originally scheduled for, I believe, June 3rd or 4th of that year. I can't remember which one it is. But it ends up getting pushed back because of weather. It was raining and it was storming over the English Channel, which was the body of water separating France, Normandy, France, which is where this landing's going to take place, and Britain. And so they didn't want to have to go on the seas in the storm. So they delayed a day or two, and then comes June 5th, and it's still storming. And they say, well, we probably better push it back. But then they realized that this secret invasion, they couldn't use like motor ships or self-propelling ships, at least not within a couple miles of Normandy. Like that'd be too loud and obvious, and that'd give away the invasion. So they had to rely on the tides. They had to rely on the motion of the water to carry them into Normandy. Well, if you know anything about tidal waves, the tides are directly impacted by the position of the moon. And our position with the moon changes periodically, but the position of the moon was in such a way that if they postponed any more days, then they would be out of the tidal position for another 3 or 4 weeks. And they could not wait 3 or 4 more weeks. Germany was gaining ground. So they decided that despite the storm, they would launch the mission in the middle of the night, or I guess early morning of June 6th. And so all of these soldiers, and they're from all over. There's French soldiers, there's British soldiers, there's Canadian soldiers and Australians, but a majority were Americans. A hefty majority were between the ages of 24 and 18. And there were even some 16 and 17-year-olds. Imagine being a teenager and you are riding a boat in complete darkness. Like you're crossing the English Channel at about 3 a.m. and there's a storm all around you and the place is rocking, water spilling in, and you're going through terrible seasickness. And on top of that, you are operating what for the first groups to land in Normandy is most likely going to be a suicide mission. You're going to have imminent German artillery raining down on you. Imagine that situation. That's why it's kind of become a joke now that whenever you talk to older people and they hear you complain about the way things are now, they bring up, well, when I was 18, I stormed the beaches of Normandy with an M16. But in reality, that was a horrifying experience, and one that I don't think any of us could actually mentally put ourselves in. That's why D-Day is so revered, and that's why the people that were a part of it are so loved and revered and respected, is because of the bravery it took. That was a horrifying mission that they took on. And they land the beaches, and there's, what is there, 4 or 5 beaches? Gosh, I should know that. Juneau, Gould, Utah, Omaha, Sword. Okay. So 5 beaches. And they're all a couple miles apart. Like, you're not fighting side by side with the other groups. But they're all supposed to take certain positions, and they all faced different troubles as they traverse through the land. First of all, you're getting off a ship and you're running onto a beach, and you're trying to A, avoid gunfire, B, there's all kinds of like barbed wire and stuff on the beach to keep any kind of invasion from happening, and you're probably also battling seasickness. And the original like goals for the operation were not realized or didn't happen for a couple weeks. Like, the initial charge was not all that successful in a couple of the beaches. A couple of them were repelled pretty hard. Then there's paratroopers that are flying overhead and trying to land behind enemy lines. Some of them dropped and missed their drop point and were parachuting down into like German camps, and they're being shot at up in the air. Imagine just floating down slowly with your parachute, and there are machine guns pointed up in the sky at you, and you can't actually do anything to avoid them. That has got to be one of the most empty and depressing feelings there is. But the sheer will and determination of Allied soldiers perseveres, and Normandy is taken back by the Allies, and from there the Allies sweep down through France and slowly but surely kick the Germans out in order to liberate Western Europe, France as well as Western Europe. So the end of the war in Europe takes place. D-Day starts the liberation of France. Liberation means freedom. To liberate means to gain freedom. They liberated France from the Nazis. They liberated the rest of Western Europe, like Belgium and Switzerland, Northern Italy, parts of Poland, liberated by the US, French, and British after D-Day within the coming months. Now, with victory close, we're approaching victory. American President Franklin Roosevelt dies. He was battling a disease known as polio. He'd had for many years, basically his entire presidency, he'd had polio, which we have a vaccine for today. They didn't back then. FDR dies, and he was president of the U.S. for 14 years. Or 13 years. A long time to be president. And he dies, and less than 3 weeks later, Germany surrenders. Now that's notable, at least to me, because it's great. The Allies got Germany to surrender, but it's kind of sad and disappointing that President Roosevelt doesn't actually get to see it. You know, he'd worked so hard and he'd seen everything and all the terrible things that have been going on, and yeah, he doesn't get to see it. Eastern Europe is liberated by the Soviets. Now that liberation should have an asterisk because they won't be free, not completely, under Soviet influence. And seeing the writing on the wall, seeing that the war was ending and he was not going to be treated very well in custody, he knew that. So Adolf Hitler takes his own life. So this is where the story of my great-grandfather comes in. And I've told, I think maybe one of my classes, I told maybe two of them actually. I don't really know. I don't know how much I told, but I'm going to go ahead and try and tell it here really quickly. My great-grandfather, so my dad's mother, her dad, was a soldier in World War II, and he was a part of a regiment. He wasn't involved in the D-Day invasion, but in the follow-up, once in early April, when they knew that victory was imminent, victory was going to happen, they sent a small American troop to Germany, basically to survey Berlin, which was the capital. They were going to be on the lookout for any kind of Nazi war criminals that may try and escape. But they were also there to make sure that the Germans and the Soviets didn't erupt into mass chaos in Berlin. They knew the Soviets were on their way, and the Soviets were coming to do damage. I talked a lot about how Stalin hated Hitler and he wanted to watch him burn and he wanted revenge. And he told Roosevelt and he told the Americans, stay out of my way. When I get to Berlin, there's going to be hell to pay. So the small troop, and I don't know the numbers exactly, but when I picture it, I picture no more than like 25 or 30 American troops. They're basically on a hill just outside of Berlin, kind of with eyes on the Nazi government building, like the Nazi version of the White House, I guess, if you will. And they see Hitler go into the building, we'll say one day. And so they got eyes on him. And they're waiting for him to come out, and they're waiting to make sure he doesn't try and escape or go anywhere. And they're in surveillance. Now, my great-grandfather referred to this as surveillance of Hitler's hideout. It was known that Hitler had kind of a private chamber under I believe the building was called the Wehrmacht, or Wehrmacht. And he was under, he may have been in his chamber there. That only he was allowed in. Only him and his new wife at the time, Eva Braun. So they watch Hitler go into this building, and then they're in surveillance of it for days. I mean, they've got someone watching all exits at all times, and they do not see him come out after days. So eventually they decide, well, the Soviets are getting close, like within a day's march. So we'd probably better move, and Berlin's a ghost town. Like there's people still there, but they don't see really any traffic going in and out of the Wehrmacht. So they decide to move in, and they go into the Wehrmacht, and they find his chamber. They go down there, and there's no bodies. They go through the chamber. They find all these things, all these personal belongings of Adolf Hitler. Candles, like a set of German pistols, and the American soldiers just start like taking stuff, like souvenirs. And my great-grandfather ends up leaving with this sword. It is a dress sword. It is a sword that is meant just to go with the uniform. Like, it is not meant for combat. That thing has no sharpness on the edges whatsoever. Couldn't cut butter. I have looked up this sword, or I've looked up images. This was a sword that belonged to a high-ranking Nazi official. It wasn't only like reserved for Adolf Hitler. Like, there was probably 20 high-ranking Nazis that wore this sword. It was leaning, I think, up against like a seat or something. And my great grandfather, that he took it. That was something he took, and he passed away when I was like 4 or 5. And when he died, he gave it to his his first grandson, which was my dad. So this is currently in my dad's possession. Last time I was home, I dug it out, dusted it off, and took pictures of it. So I can't say 100% this is Hitler's sword. No proof of it. But I have read and do know that he did not let many, if anybody, into his chamber. And the odds of someone else coming into Hitler's chamber and taking off their sword and leaving it there, I don't think are that high, but it's not impossible. So I like to claim this is Adolf Hitler's dress sword. Is it fact? No. It's not proven fact. But it makes the story better. And, you know, I could possibly get it validated somehow, but part of me doesn't want to, because then I'm worried they would tell me, well, it's not actually his sword, and that'd kind of damper it a little bit. I'd rather have the memory and the thought of it. But they didn't see his body in the chamber. And people talk about, the conspiracy theories of, did Hitler get away? I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so, because my great-grandfather had told my grandmother, or I guess actually he told his wife, and then his wife told my grandmother, that while he personally didn't see it, he says that there were soldiers that found Hitler's body entombed in Berlin. Like, he was taken to a tomb and placed in it. Now, the reason no one has found Hitler's body is because shortly after that American troop left Berlin, they left because they knew the Soviets were coming and they were going to do damage, and they couldn't stop them. When the Soviets got to Berlin, they tore that place apart, and it is said that the Soviets found Hitler's body. They found his tomb, and they destroyed it. They did horrific things. They took it out, they paraded it, they burned it. They probably turned his body into ash and spit on it and just scattered it all around. So yeah, you're not going to find Hitler's body, because I'm pretty sure the Soviets destroyed every piece of evidence that had ever existed. Because that's exactly what Joseph Stalin wanted them to do. So that's my personal rebuttal whenever anyone brings up the idea that Hitler ran off to Argentina like some other Nazi officers. No, I think he did take his life, and then his body was meant to be placed in a protected tomb that the Soviets got to and destroyed it, because that was their mission, and that's what they reported back to Stalin that they did. Now, they could have lied out of fear of Stalin, but I think they actually did it. So that's the story of my great-grandfather and his precious sword. He etched his name in the side of this. You can't see it, but in the picture on the right, it's got my great-grandfather's initials. Now, you're going to say there's no swastika on it. Well, first of all, there's the SS insignia on on that little tassel. SS was their like secret police of the not secret, but their police of the Nazi Party. And then up in the handle, that little emblem, it's an eagle, and on that eagle, which you can't see from this angle, you have to get really close to your face, is a swastika. So it is authentic. So now we're going to go to the essential question. Think back to D-Day. What country was invaded and liberated from due to D-Day? And it's one country. It's the invasion of one country and the liberation of that same country. Basically, which country was freed? Which country was invaded by the Allies and freed as a result of it? So that is it for today. I went a little long, but I like telling that story. It's fascinating to me, and I'm proud of the accomplishments of my ancestors. So I like to tell it. That'll be it. We'll have a Zoom meeting on Thursday, tomorrow. Just talk, catch up. We can talk about this, or I have a question of the day, whatever. Be short again, but just touching base. So I'll talk to you guys then. Have a good one and take care.